this next week when I have the YouTube channel all done up and set up with everything, and everything up until what we start recording today will be on the YouTube channel for everybody to go and check out. So, all right, we are at chapter 4, We Agnostics, and kind of just to kind of set things up, the purpose thus far has been the steps 1 and 2, basically kind of identifying with the problem and the solution. And now we want to talk a little bit about our higher power. I'm sorry, say again.
Oh, we're going into step 3.
Yep, going into step 3. That's absolutely it. And a couple of things here is that we agnostics, I think that they could have named this We Agnostics, Atheists, and the True Believers. Okay, I want to say that as a disclaimer, because the true believers, those that are very religious, usually tend to think that they've got this. And we're not talking about that form of religion or that type of connection to God. So this is a bit different. It's still, and I say this as well, we are a spiritual / religious entity. We do talk about God. There are prayers, and it's a big part of the program. But again, this is one of those chapters that can apply to even the true believers. And with that, we'll get started. Rob?
Okay, again, everybody, we're on page 44. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Absolutely.
So a couple of things here. In the preceding chapters, we've learned something of alcoholism. That's a resounding yes. Second question here, as much as anything, is if you, we hope you have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. At this point, having gone through the book with a sponsor and somebody that is aligned with the program and the solution in the book, at this point in time, you should be pretty clear as to whether or not you're an alcoholic or not, and what the differences are between the two. And you will have answered for yourself. And this is just one more time of kind of restating the question itself. And that is if you cannot quit entirely when drinking and have little control over the amount, which we're talking about, the malady and the allergy. So the two symptoms there. And when we talk about a spiritual experience, and we're going to talk more about that as we go along, we're talking also about that complete psychic change. Okay. Rob?
Yeah, this is going to be, page 44 is the last page that they're going to talk about alcoholism per se. And then we're going to get into the human condition. The idea here is to change our belief systems, how we think about, God, basically, taking away our prejudice and coming up with our new conception. Mm-hmm. To one who feels he is atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible, but to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face.
Yeah, I guess I might say that somebody at this point in time might feel like they're between a rock and a hard place. All right. Just as another way of phrasing this particular passage right here that Rob just read. And obviously, it may seem impossible, but I think that even for those that are the agnostic type or atheists, they can find reasons for being spiritual. And again, I think that there is some differences there between being religious and being spiritual. And I think that they're tied together, and there's not mutually exclusive necessarily, but then again, they might be. But to continue on means disaster. So it's, again, you just, you're looking around going, hey, I can't quit. I'm in trouble. I don't know what to do. I don't believe in God, et cetera, et cetera. Or the fact that you're bringing God into this really is a detractor and kind of something that I want to push away from. But again, just like Rob had said, we're here to try and change your mind in regards to that, because the outcome, if you don't, is basically a very bad, it's a very bad outcome. So, Rob?
Leo, it says here, to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. If I'm facing death, I would think it would be easy to accept spiritual help. But if my ideas of what God or what spirituality is so negative, maybe death is what I'm looking for. And that's why with some people, we really have to change their conceptions of what and who God is. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life, or else. Perhaps it is going to be that way with you, but cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted.
Yeah, and I think the very end here is that, if you're coming into this somewhat pensive and uptight, I would just say, relax. This isn't really, we're not pushing hard on this. We're just trying to get you to kind of sit back, open your mind, and be accepting of a new thought process and a new way of life, and something that you can adopt. And again, we talked about this also, when that is that whether you have that epiphany and you have this overwhelming change that is this very drastic kind of immediate kind of feeling, or if you're what they call the educational type, that is over time, you get small baby steps, sometimes big steps, maybe a step back, but you slowly get there, and then one day you wake up and you find out that you've kind of crossed over into that new way of life. All of those are okay, and nobody expects you to get this at the drop of a hat or at the snap of a finger. So we'll try to walk through this, but the big thing here is just to relax and just kind of sit back and understand that you've got to find this spiritual basis of life, or else I am going to say that as a disclaimer, this is really a requirement to recovery based on the program that's outlined in this book. So we do need to get it, but it's different for everybody, and the amount that you get and when you get it and stuff is going to be different for all. Rob?
Okay, and agnostic. Ag means without, and gnostic means knowledge. So an agnostic is someone without knowledge of God. A person who believes that nothing is known or can be known of the existence or nature of God. Just want to throw that out there. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly.
Yep, and that we're going to talk about here, but this is really the crux of where we're going in regards to this and that recovery, and that is to say that human power is going to be able to give you what you need to overcome your alcoholism and to be able to stop drinking and stay sober for the long haul. So that's really what they're trying to do, is set the stage for that. They're basically saying that, hey, if we'd have just lived by a code of morals or a better philosophy of life, you would have recovered long ago. In other words, if there were, the standard human condition type things, if you were able to do that, then you really weren't gonna, you really don't have the problem here. And I think that's another way of kind of saying that, if you can't do that, then you obviously are alcoholic, and that's a difficult thing to overcome. And you've got to find that inner strength and that power. And everything you've tried at this point, no matter how hard you've tried, has failed utterly. So just basically setting the stage, and without jumping into it, this next passage right here, basically the next couple of sentences are some of the most powerful in the direct kind of description as to where we actually are. Rob?
Lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power?
Yeah, and that's true for all of us. So that I've highlighted everything that Rob just said. I've underlined the lack of power was our dilemma. If you spend any time with us and others that are in Big Book studies in the Keystone group, the lack of power was our dilemma. We will refer to this particular passage again and again and again, just to make sure that we actually get what we're trying to understand. So power greater than ourselves. This is going to be where we reach for this very personal and private inner strength, and it's going to have to come from deep within, but it's going to be something that you're going to have to find as we go along. And the nice thing is that it's asking the question as to where we're going to find this power. The good news is that the book is going to answer exactly that. So, all right.
That's one great thing about this book, Leo, is that, whenever there is a question that asks, it's not for us to answer it. They will answer it for us. The great thing about this chapter too, we've come up to this chapter, we've talked about what the problem is. What is alcoholism? So we've got a good understanding of what alcoholism is. Now we're going to get into what is the solution. And then later on, they're going to get into the course of action. So right now, we're finding out the solution is power. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. Here, difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope arise as we discuss his alcoholic problem and explain our fellowship. But his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, where we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored.
And this is true for a lot of us. Obviously, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this particular paragraph, and that to highlight the fact that this is exactly what this book is about. And its main object is to enable you to find this power. Once you find this power, you're going to find that there's a lot of things, not just your alcoholism, that you're going to be able to overcome in ways that you've never experienced before. And it is, in fact, going to solve your problem. This isn't it might, it may, it is going to solve your problem. And I want to also make that distinction as well. But one of the things that we get to here, and I'll talk a little bit on the personal level, I don't refer to my higher power as God, and that's okay. It's not meant that you have to. And those that do don't bother me anymore at all, that they do refer to God. So I typically just call it my higher power. And that's what I tap into and have been successful at now for quite some time. But just mentioning that, and again, I was one of those, and there's a number of people out there that can raise their hand and say, yep, I was that person too. As soon as I got into an AA meeting in the fellowship and they started talking about God, my shoulders would drop, or I'd basically start to tune things out, and I would look around and say, the last thing I wanted to do was to go to church. And the fact is I was wrong, and we're not going to church, and that's not what this is about. So it took me a while to get over my objections and my prejudices with regard to this concept. And but it did happen, and I'm fine with everything now. And when we talk about spiritual matters and stuff, I'm fine when people talk about God, and I have no problems saying the word God or anything like that. But just for me personally, just to let you know, so that you kind of get that idea, and you may, as a sponsor, come across this, or maybe it's yourself. I just call it my higher power, and that's entirely okay. So
remember, Bill had a problem with God too. He had his prejudices from when he was a little child, and what his grandfather had talked to him about when they wanted him to sign that temperance agreement, that he would never take a drink. His grandfather didn't want him to sign it. He didn't sign it. He grew up with these prejudices. So when Ebby came to see him, Ebby said, come up with your own conception. Come up with a new idea of what God is to you. We know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We looked upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked askance at many individuals who claimed to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet in other moments we found ourselves thinking, when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost.
yeah, and a couple of highlights here is that we were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. And that seems to be a common thread for a lot of folks in a lot of cultures even. I would just say that we're going to find that a reliance on a higher power or God is not a weakness, but rather a strength. After all, you rely on other things to add to yourself in some manner or fashion to increase your own strength. And so I think that that's one of the misnomers and mischaracterizations that we need to get rid of. And that is that reliance upon this higher power or God is not a weakness, but rather a strength. And sure, you look around and you can point fingers. I did. I was, they even bring up that things that happened to you when you were in your childhood and stuff. I was very messed up with going to church for a number of reasons that have occurred to me that were negative, in fact, very negative when it came to going to church and being a part of a religious entity and recognizing God. But yeah, do we and a lot of people think that how do we comprehend a supreme being? So it's this overwhelming feeling. It is it's personal, it's enlightening, it's awe, it's kind of this awe-inspiring. And when they talk about looking at a starlit night, if you haven't, and I would say almost to a person, if not 100, I mean, just 100% of looking up at night at the stars and realizing just how small and insignificant you are in comparison to everything else in that vastness. And when you take that and kind of have that openness of here I am in this tiny little thing that's in this massive, environment and worldly kind of thing, how did it all start? Something happened to create all of this, and it is still kind of mind-bending, if you will, as to how all of it came about. But it has to be that there's got to be something out there that started this. And believe me, I'm married to a scientist, and so I have very staunch feelings about science, and even science can't necessarily answer how all of this came to be. So that's in part how I started to warm to the idea of a higher power. So with that, Rob?
Yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God.
Yeah. And so here's this: we found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results. So I underline this part here, is that even to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves. That's all that's required here. And this is important, especially if you're a sponsor or if you're working with a newcomer, just trying to get them kind of indoctrinated into this program. They don't have to just, it's not an absolute requirement that they have to believe in God or in a power greater than themselves, just like that. They just have to be willing to believe. That's it. Willing to believe is all that's required. And I think that needs to be emphasized, because it gets lost, I think, sometimes, because of the strength that people bring to some of these discussions with, well, I believe in God, or my higher power, et cetera, et cetera. And you need to get that. Well, yeah, you need to get it, but it doesn't mean that if you don't get it immediately, that you're not a part of this program and you're not a part of the solution. So I want to make that clear. It is just a willingness to believe in a power greater than yourselves. That's that word, willingness. So, Rob?
I've got a couple of notes here. Accept with heart and stop trying with the mind. And the other one is how to find God, lay aside prejudice, seek, and have willingness. I tried to play God for a long period of time and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And that's why I ended up here. Much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect the contact with him. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe, underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. We found that God does not make too hard turns with those who seek him. To us, the realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men.
Yeah. So this is supposed to be easy in the concept of going from point A to point B, meaning that I don't have a higher power to the point of having a higher power. That path is supposed to be an easy path. It doesn't mean that it comes naturally. It doesn't mean that it comes like turning on a light bulb. It just means that it is meant to be something that is easy and something that you can get over time. And there is technically no time limit to it either. The big thing here on this one is that, much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. So you don't have to take Leo's conception of God or his higher power. You need to only work on your own conception, however inadequate. Now, I also want to say this as a disclaimer. We're not talking about making a lot of people will start out saying that their higher power is, and I've heard this one a number of times, is just a group of drunks. So they draw up on the strength of the fellowship and the group that they're working with and that type of thing. And there's some, those are some beginnings. But a wise person that does another big book study would talk about the fact that, the one thing you can't do is say, well, I'm going to say a doorknob is my higher power right now because I'm just getting used to the idea, the whole conception of it and everything, because now you go to this and you say, well, this doorknob is going to be able to save me from this. This doorknob is going to be able to provide me with this doorknob. So if you kind of get where I'm going here, is that in and of itself is not what we're talking about. So finding, a conception of what you think a higher power is important, but you've got to make it something that is worthwhile. And it's really not to say what it is what I'm trying to say is what it isn't. So a doorknob or a toaster or a chair or something like that is not the idea, but something such as, and I've heard people use, the power of water, because of its different states and its different ability to do things. It is something that I can, that can that is very, very powerful. That in and of itself is something that you can start to get your arms around, because now what you're doing is you're starting to equate the power of water to a higher power, something that is stronger than you, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the idea. And that's where we talk about however inadequate was sufficient to make the approach and to affect the contact with him. And hopefully the idea is that you get to this point where this higher power is something so immense that it's even bigger than water. And that's kind of where I'm going. And we are talking about, the existence, and this is where I'm talking about the difference between science and something, and that creative intelligence or that spirit of the universe. What started all of that is just something, and it's something bigger than just, biology, etc. So, no hard terms here. We don't, you're not required to make these outward declarations. You're not required to start doing certain practices and that type of thing. It is basically up to you. And I'm going to be one of those people that says that it's an incredibly private and personal thing for each individual. So it isn't my conception that's yours, it's your own. And it's not for me to define, et cetera, or ridicule, as far as that is concerned. Robin?
Leo, a wise man who does a book study on Fridays at 11 a.m. Said to me, or said in the meeting, that if you do the steps, you read them out. Came to believe that a doorknob greater than myself could restore me to sanity. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of a doorknob, as we understood him. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. So I just like to throw that out every once in a while.
Yeah, Rob, you and I are talking about the same gentleman, and that would be our very own Bill from New Jersey. But
exactly.
Excellent advice when it comes to trying to define what it is that you start out with your definition or conception of a higher power.
Surely does. We're at the top of page 47, everybody. When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions, which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth, but if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was.
Yep. And I put a little note here, and it has to make sense. And that's part of what Rob just read. And we were just talking about. One of the first things I did in writing a note on this particular paragraph here is that when therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. And I put a note out there, and it says that, and I'm not it. So that's the other part here is that you aren't God. So another one of those phrases is, so stop playing like you are. Okay. But the nice thing is that we're kind of easing into this yet again. This applies to the spiritual expressions which you find in this book. It says, do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. Again, this is a very personal and private thing. And again, at the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth. Again, it's just a willingness to believe, an openness to the concept, and the beginning of asking those questions. If I was to look at the spirit of the universe, and I'm using that phrase hypothetically, what does that mean to me? And start to kind of think in terms of that. And you're going to find that sense of wonder and that sense of awe is going to start to envelop you to some extent, and you're going to start feeling something there that you may have not felt before. So good advice going so far. Rob?
We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him he is well on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built.
Absolutely. And really here is this too, is it's really yes or no, and that's it. It's just as soon as a man can say that he does believe, or yes, I'm willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. And that's encouragement. That is encouraging. If you're working with a newcomer and they are being resistant to this whole concept, if you are able to kind of put it in terms that they might understand, where it's not this, I'm looking at this God figure and you have to believe immediately, or else that I'm just, I think where I'm trying to go here is that thought and process as a sponsor and or somebody working with a newcomer, these big objections, and boy, I was one of them. I was being a smart ass about it. And I was challenging each and everything as I could just to try and, I was just being a smart ass. So just leave it at that. The point being is that once I finally sat down, calmed down, and started to understand that this was supposed to be helpful to me, and it, and I started to open my mind, we started to get, I started to make some progress. And we are at that point where there is an asterisk, and that is the appendix 2, the spiritual experience. So what we're going to do is go to page 567, and Rob, we'll just read through that real quick. There's some good stuff at the very end of it, I think, is really one of the things I find best about this passage here. So we'll talk about it in just a second. So page 567.
Spiritual experience. The terms spiritual experience or spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which upon careful reading shows that the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many different forms. Yet it is true that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. Happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. In the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes are described. Though it was not our intention to create such an impression, many alcoholics have nevertheless concluded that in order to recover, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousness, followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. Among our rapidly growing membership, thousands of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent, are by no means the rule. Most of our experiences are what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop slowly over a period of time. Quite often, friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he is himself. He finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life, that such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. What often takes place in a few months could seldom have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. With few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped in an unsuspected inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. Most of us think this awareness of a power greater than themselves is the essence of spiritual experience. Our more religious members call it God consciousness. Most emphatically, we wish to say that any alcoholic capable of honestly facing his problems in the light of our experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. He can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. We find that no one need to have difficulty with the spirituality of the program. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. Herbert Spencer.
Yeah, so important at the very end there, that contempt prior to investigation. Hopefully, if you've got somebody that's being in a state of denial, or they're being kind of belligerent about it, it's really good to step back and get them to talk about, how they came to believe in certain things. And spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, it's very personal. And I want to take a moment here for just to describe spiritual experience in different terms. I can tell you that the birth of a child is something that I think is awe-inspiring for people. And I think when they're standing there or sitting there watching a newborn sleep, and you're just in awe of the little hands and fingers and everything, and there's this little human that just got brought into the world, I would just say that is a spiritual experience. A morning prior to a hurricane coming in on the coast and watching these large waves come crashing and rolling in against the rocks and the shoreline, it can also be a spiritual experience. Sitting back and hearing noises, maybe it's the morning birds that are singing, or maybe it's a particular passage of music that you have, and you're able to kind of depart from yourself there and float a bit to just hear these things and look around in a way that is different, I think is also a spiritual experience. My personal thing is something, and that is that I was able to be fortunate enough to be able to learn to fly. And I have had moments in the air while I was flying where I was not in at all, my gauges and my instruments were all in the right place. I was in control of this aircraft, and I was in a space around me that was just different. And for me, that was a spiritual experience for me. I felt closer to something, and I felt distant from other things. And it was just kind of this different kind of feeling that I've had. And I've got a handful of those that I could sit down and spend half an hour describing to you, but they wouldn't really mean that much other than maybe, my ability to describe them to you. But unless you've experienced that, you wouldn't understand what I consider as my own spiritual experience and that type of thing. So I want to make sure that you understand that a spiritual experience doesn't necessarily mean that you have to somehow become, connected to God, and that is something that you've got to kind of get through to yourself. And there are things in here I hope that you've been able to underline and highlight. The beginning of this spiritual experience passage is really trying to kind of put your fears aside, that again, you don't have to have this immediate thing happen to you. It doesn't have to be so overwhelming at the very start of things, and you don't have to just, lay down everything and say, "Oh, I believe." Some people get those kind of experiences and they have those epiphanies. But others, like myself, it took me some time to kind of put some application to it. And probably I would say that I had to lay down my scientific prejudices, and put those on a shelf and not turn my back on them, but just set them aside so that I could clear my mind and start thinking in terms of what it was with being a spiritual experience. And I think that this is important at the end, and I did a lot of highlighting at the end. This is, most of us think this awareness of a power greater than ourselves is the essence of the spiritual experience, and I certainly believe that. But I don't necessarily call it a God consciousness. So again, I'm one that just kind of talks about it as my higher power. But this willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness, those I will tell you, those are requirements. You've got to have that. And if you are a skilled sponsor and you've got somebody that's being kind of difficult, this is one of the places that I would start. Are you willing? Do you want to be honest? And are you going to open your mind to some new and different ideas and thoughts? And just turn them into some questions and give some examples of your own your own issues and challenges that you might have had, and kind of get the person to kind of get, what you're trying to do figuratively is to get them to put their sword and their shield down and just sit back and relax and start to open up to new and different ideas. And these concepts of a higher power then become easier to accept. Rob?
Leo, I'm just going to add on to that in the fact that one of the greatest analogies that was ever given to me about God, or the concept of God, is that we can't see wind. But what we can do is we can see the wind's effect. We can see the branches of trees moving. We can see leaves being pushed across the grass. We can see the grass move with the wind. And God is like that. We don't see him, but we can see the effects that God has in our life if we look for them. Coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous. So just want to throw that in.
Yeah.
So we're back to page. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. There's trying to give you not only the idea of what this chapter is about, but also to give you some tools and some ideas of how you might approach that next alcoholic. And things like Rob that he brings up and stuff are excellent ways of trying to explain or describe. And I find that of incredible value. So I just wanted to say that that's part of what we do and why we do what we do.
That was great news to us, for we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we say, I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes, but I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level.
Absolutely. And I kind of took the middle of this paragraph. And when people presented us with the spiritual approaches, how frequently did we say, I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it will work if I could only believe as he believes, but I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. Okay, so some people make it look easy, and others, I think that with your difficulties in accepting this is that it looks really hard. I want to emphasize that questioning and just sitting down, having somebody relax, letting them know that there is no requirement that they get their higher power in one sitting or in one conversation. It's not a requirement beyond just a willingness to believe. And oh, by the way, are you willing? Are you wanting to be honest? And are you going to try and have an open mind to these new and different ideas? And it's really what we're trying to kind of just bring home in this regard. And that's what I feel like that this paragraph is all about. And it is comforting to learn that we can commence at a simpler level. And guess what? I think it's going to be answered here in just a second as to what that simpler level is. Rob?
Beside its seemingly inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasonably prejudice. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were.
Yeah, and they're just telling you that, guess what? Some people were prejudiced for a long period of time. I wrote up here, and these are kind of the opposites of willingness. Honesty and open-mindedness is basically stubbornness, closed-mindedness, and refusal to change. So when we talk about this obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice, we are talking about that very essence of that closed off from new idea kind of state. If somebody is that closed off and they don't aren't willing to have an open mind and to think about things, there's really a couple of things that have to happen. One, you've got to ask yourself whether or not this person really wants to become sober and recover from alcoholism. So first and foremost, and if they aren't, then you kind of have your answer at that point, and you can just make yourself available to them as they go back and to their current way of living, and maybe they just need a little bit more time to kind of process and that type of thing. But the second part of this is that it's this kind of going back to my old days of negotiating. Well, I actually still do that, but there's a couple of other questions I'm going to introduce to you guys. And I'm going to talk in terms of business first, but I'm going to quickly change it over. First of all, is the business real? Second, is it winnable? And third, is it worth it? Okay. So you have to answer yes to all three of those if you're going to pursue something in business. All right. Now, if you have a no, then you've got two options. You can just take it as a no and move on, which you're then not wasting your time on something that either isn't real, isn't winnable, or isn't worth it. Okay. But the second part of it is you can change it to a yes. So this is where I'm going to be as far as this non-believer, this person that's kind of being obstinate, that is unwilling to be open-minded. I'm going to try and change that to a yes. So is this person really serious about recovery? Is the business real? Yes. Okay. So we're going to get to that yes. Is it winnable? All right. Am I competing against something that is insurmountable at the time? All right. So maybe this person is living, maybe they're a bartender, and maybe they are surrounded by alcoholics. Maybe they've got alcohol at their and it's going to be a tough uphill battle. And maybe you've got the ability to get them to take a break, whether that's a 2-week vacation or from their jobs, or maybe to try and find something else in the restaurant industry, for example, to do besides just being a bartender, something like that. And then again, is it worth it? Well, okay, we can all, as recovering alcoholics, tell ourselves that, yes, this is worth it. So that's probably one of the easiest yes questions you would ask yourself in regards to this. So where I'm going with this is that you identify the person that they want to recover. You get to see how serious they are about it, how open-minded they are, how willing they are, how honest they want to be, etc. And you can kind of take that. So if you take those three questions, is it real? Is it winnable? And is it worth it? If you can say yes, and you're looking at Leo, and Leo is wanting it and everything, then you can move to the next step. And remember, my other one is that you're focusing on the alcoholic, you're earning that right to advance, and you're persuading them through involvement. Okay, so you're kind of getting them kind of to warming up to the idea. And I'm telling you this because these are sales techniques, but that's what we're trying to do, is we are working with a person and selling them on the idea that they can truly recover from alcoholism if they find this higher power, and we're going to help them find it. And so is this book, especially this book. Rob?
The practical individual of today is a stickler for facts and results. Nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories for all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. We have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. Everybody believes them without a murmur of doubt. Why this ready acceptance? Simply because it is impossible to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point.
And sure, you can identify with people that are more science oriented and they are more fact based, and they want to basically put their hands and eyes on something. You go back to Rob's description of the wind. I think that's a perfect one, in that you can't see the wind itself, but you can see the effects. Well, it's hard to argue the concept of not being able to see something, but still see the effects of that something. And that's kind of what they're talking about here. So I just, again, this is a good description of how to approach it, even if it is just yourself, because you're a part of this group. and you're questioning it, and or if you're working with someone else. But it's a good starting point to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point. Rob?
Everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence, but no perfect visual proof. Does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? It is being constantly revealed as mankind studies the material world that outward appearances are not inward reality at all. To illustrate, the precise steel girder is a mass of electrons whirling around each other at incredible speed. These tiny bodies are governed by precise laws, and these laws hold true throughout the material world. Science tells us so. We have no reason to doubt it. When, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as you see it, there is an all-powerful, guiding, creative intelligence. Right there, our perverse streak comes to the surface, and we laboriously set out to convince ourselves it isn't so. We read wordy books and indulge in windy arguments, thinking we believe this universe needs no God to explain it. Were our contentions true, it would follow that life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere.
Yeah. So I think sometimes I get a bit wordy on my description of the opposite, which is that there is something out there beyond just science. But this is really just kind of setting the stage to kind of, again, if you're reading this to somebody that's being kind of objectionable to the whole idea and everything, they're probably going to identify with these paragraphs and these passages that Rob is reading right now. So I just take these for what they are, and stop for a moment and ask, is this you? We have no reason to doubt it. When, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is an all-powerful, guiding, creative intelligence. I've had to ask myself, how did the planets and the universe get here? I know we talk about the Big Bang Theory, but what happened before the Big Bang? What happened before? What created the stars, and et cetera, et cetera? And I just don't believe that science can answer that. And that's where I get into this, there's an all-powerful, guiding, creative intelligence out there, that something happened beyond what can be either comprehended or explained. So that's a good starting point for me. I'm not saying it is for everybody, but if it works for you, please start there. Rob?
Leo, it is 12:53. Did we want to bring Mr. Bill in?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We'll just do that and stop here for the day. And Bill, welcome. Yep, there we go.
Hi, this is Bill, alcoholic from New Jersey. Thanks a lot, Leo and Rob. Good job. A very good presentation. This here chapter 4 is like really an amazing chapter. Bill Wilson wrote this, and Bill had absolutely no theological training, no religious training, and he wrote one of the most spiritual things that probably the world has ever seen. When Bill had his spiritual experience, something really dramatic happened to him. I mean, he was not a religious person. He didn't like going to church. He didn't hang out with church people. And he came out with all of this wonderful spiritual stuff. So it was really, really amazing how this whole thing took place and how this happened. And right in the beginning, it like was mentioned, or Leo mentioned, they have 2 questions you can ask yourself, and that kind of like tells you that you probably are an alcoholic. Well, one is, when you honestly want to, can you quit entirely? Or if when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take. One tells us about the mental part, and one tells us about the physical part of alcoholism. And it says you're probably alcoholic. This book does not try to tell anybody that they are an alcoholic. In order to do step 1, you have to admit that you're powerless over alcohol. On page 30, it said we have to concede to our innermost self. This book cannot concede that for me. I have to do that myself. That's why the book doesn't pronounce anybody an alcoholic, and it just says you're probably alcoholic. We have to do it ourselves. If I don't do it, if my sponsor tells me I'm an alcoholic, that is not step one. I have to concede to my innermost self. So that's why the book doesn't really tell us, whether we are or we're not. It just gives us some evidence that we can make our own decision. And then it tells us to be doomed in alcoholic death or live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. That's what that's doing. That's telling us that if you have another disease, people that have like cancer, if they were told to use spirituality, they would say, "Give me the spirituality instantly." With alcoholism, it's not an easy alternative to face. That shows you the level of mental health that we're dealing with here. How bad is this alcoholic death? I don't want the spirituality. That's basically what he's saying here to us. Yeah. Then he gives us directions and warnings in the next paragraph. It says we must find the spiritual basis of life, or else what? Or else we're going to have that alcoholic death. That's basically what Bill's trying to get across to us here. And he tells us on two different pages, on page 46 and on page 47, that we can use our own conception. I don't have to believe what anybody else believes. As long as I use my own conception, that makes sense to me. And like was already mentioned, it's got to fit in the steps. If your conception doesn't fit in the steps, it's not going to work. If you're doing a 12-step program, whatever conception you're going to use of God has to fit in the 12 steps. As long as it fits in the 12 steps, it's good. And I skipped over. It told us the main object of the book. The main object of the book is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself that will solve your problem. That's what the object of this book is. Not for me to stop drinking. It's for me to find a power greater than myself, which will solve my problem. And if it's a power greater than myself, that means it's not me. It has to be greater than me. And on page 47, they have what's called the second step question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, there is a power greater than myself? If you can say yes to that, as long as you believe or you're just willing to believe, you've done everything that this book requires to do step 2. That's it. There's no big work involved with this. All you have to do is be willing to believe that there's something greater than yourself, and that's it. You've done step 2. And then they talked about the spiritual experience, and the spiritual experience in the back of the book. All that means is change. That's all the spiritual experience means. It just means we're going to change. Whether you want to call it a transformation or a psychic change or a personality change or sudden and spectacular upheavals. Bill uses all different words, and they all mean change. What Bill's telling us here in this chapter is we have to change our mind. We have to start believing in something that's more powerful than ourselves, because when we're left to our own devices and we just believe in ourselves, it doesn't work. The simplest way I can put it is, I'd rather act like there is a God and find out there isn't than to act like there isn't and find out there is. So basically all this whole chapter is about Bill's giving us some logical reasons on why it makes more sense to believe in something than to believe in nothing. All right, thanks a lot for letting me share. That's all I got.
Thanks very much, Bill.
Yep. All right. So we'll close out with the serenity prayer, and then we'll just open up for questions or comments.
You got it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference.
All right.
Thank you, Leo. One.
You bet, Pam.
Thanks, Pam. Great to see you, as always. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Bill.
Anybody have any questions, comments? Leanne, you look like you're thinking.
Yeah, always thinking. I think that's the problem. Too much thinking.
Too much.
No, this was a good meeting. Yeah, I heard some good stuff about the willingness and just I'm really struggling with trying to believe, and it's apparently I'm putting too much effort into trying to believe. It's just, I just got to look around, and yeah. So thanks for that.
Oh, good, good.
Remember, belief is something that you believe that something can happen. Faith is that it will happen.
I had a sponsor I used to say, if you don't believe in a power greater than yourself, you go down to the train and stop and try and stop the next train from coming in. And then I was living in Connecticut, and there was like 2 people had died by stepping in front of a chain. So he had to change his analogy. He said, go down to the beach and try to stop the next wave, and so,
Yeah, I think that I like the wave one a little bit better.
yeah, well, I like the wind one. I like the wind one. That was a good example.
Take care. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Paul. We'll see you on Friday. Remember, everybody, Bill has his meeting at 11 a.m. Eastern time on Fridays. The information is in the chat. If you didn't get the information from the chat, just contact me. Either text me or email me, and I'll make sure you get all the information from Bill's meeting.